At this time, we are pleased to welcome back Professor Alfred de Zayas. Of course, he has spoken at a number of our panel presentations in the past. Dr. de Zayas is professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He is a leading expert in the field of human rights and international law and a high-ranking United Nations official. He was the original UN independent expert for a democratic and equitable international order. He is also a former senior lawyer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and the Chief of Petitions. He has authored a number of books in several languages. His latest book is titled Building a Just World Order, published by Clarity Press. Professor Zayas, thank you so much for joining us again. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, excellencies, delegates, friends, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk today, among other things, about Resolution 48/7 of the 8th of October, 2021. This is a really groundbreaking resolution. And those countries that tabled it, those countries that argued for it, those countries that had it adopted deserve the gratitude of the world, not just of the colonial peoples or peoples living under occupation or people who have not reached self-governance. I am very convinced that there must be follow-up to this resolution. What does the resolution say? Well, in upper paragraph 6, it talks about holding a panel. Now, a United Nations panel can be a standard setting panel, but it can also be yet another exercise in futility. It is important that independent experts participate in this panel, and that it not be just friends of governments who essentially want to forget about colonialism and the legacy of colonialism. Colonialism continues today. It's not only the sequels of colonialism, it is the practice of neocolonialism by the Bretton Woods institutions, I mean by the World Bank and by the International Monetary Fund. As you know, 2017, I presented a report to the Human Rights Council on the adverse impacts of certain policies and certain projects of the World Bank. I also presented a report to the General Assembly on the adverse impacts of the International Monetary Fund, particularly in the Third World, particularly in highly indebted countries that then essentially become economic hostages of the IMF and of the powerful countries. Now, that is a form of colonialism, and that must end, and people must call a spade a spade. Now, beyond that, I would like to see the Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples be given more substance. I don't agree with all of the declaration. I think that it was very modest, but let's face it, countries are not observing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The rights of Indigenous peoples continue being violated systematically by governments that ostensibly are committed to human rights, including the United States and Canada. Now, since the discovery of mass graves outside residential schools and other educational institutions where indigenous were supposed to be made less indigenous, so they're supposed to be integrated into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant societies that we are. That, of course, is a scandal. And Tamara Starblanket, in her book, Suffer the Little Children, she explains it very well with regard to Canada, but we had the same problem in the United States. That is actually only the tip of the iceberg. The indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada today are still being exploited. Their natural resources are still being taken away from them. And the idea of a free, prior, and informed consent is not being observed. I allow myself to quote from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also same language in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 1. All peoples have the right of self-determination. But then Article 2, all peoples may, for their own ends, dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case, I repeat, in no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. Well, that has happened. And I think that the indigenous, in many countries, the indigenous are as poor as church mice. They're not even able to hire appropriate legal representation in order to go to domestic courts and fight for their rights. But what I insist on is that this mindset, this attitude of holier than thou, this attitude that we, the rich countries, we can tell the poor countries what is good for them, that has to be abandoned. That is a, shall we say, a vestige of colonialism. Today, there are other forms of economic colonialism in the form of unilateral coercive measures, which is a form of blackmail. You want countries to vote your way, so you apply a degree of pressure on them in the General Assembly, in the ECOSOC, in the Human Rights Council, in order to get your way. But that, of course, is contrary to the letter and spirit of the UN Charter, and contrary to the right of self-determination and to the principle of the sovereign equality of states. Now, looking at this groundbreaking resolution 48/7, I found that the operative paragraphs do not ask enough. I think the operative paragraphs must ask for substantial reparations to be paid to all the colonial peoples. And that is probably why a certain number of countries who did not dare to vote against the adoption of the resolution, but countries who abstained, who did not support the language of the resolution. Among those countries, allow me to read: Austria, Bahrain, Bulgaria, Czechia, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Libya, Marshall Islands, Mauritania, Netherlands, Poland, Republic of Korea, Senegal, Togo, Ukraine, United Kingdom, and Uzbekistan. I consider that a disgrace. And if there are any delegates in the room right now from these countries, I would ask you to take the floor and explain why your delegation voted against adoption of this rather moderate, rather modest resolution. As I said, a panel will be held let us hope that that panel actually has a plan of action, that that panel will put forward a roadmap in order to achieve the rights contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a model d'emploi, how to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent means something. Allow me to read briefly from the 25 principles of international order that I formulated for the Human Rights Council back in 2018, and which I published in Building a Just World Order. Principle 10, the right of self-determination of peoples as stipulated in the UN Charter and in Common Article 1 of the ICCPR on ICESC, is a fundamental principle of international law, jus cogens, and international public policy. All peoples, I repeat, all peoples without exception are rights holders of self-determination. The duty bearers are all states members of the UN. The exercise of self-determination is an expression of democracy, as democracy is an expression of self-determination. It attains enhanced legitimacy when a referendum is organized and monitored under the auspices of the United Nations. Now, we're not talking just about decolonization. We're talking about decolonized countries that have a right to self-determination, have a right to their own futures, their own identities and cultures. The European colonization of Africa left totally, shall we say, absurd frontiers in Africa, straight lines cutting through ethnic groups, religious groups, linguistic groups, etc., separating peoples. Now, these peoples have a right to their self-determination. And the United Nations should be the first to recognize that, and should be the first to organize self-determination referenda for these people who have not attained self-determination. Among them, I can think of the boobies of Bioko, of Fernando Po, which was joined with Equatorial Guinea against their will. And I can think of Southern Cameroon that wants to be separate from Northern Cameroon. But I can think of so many countries in the world. I can think of so many peoples, whether it be Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands that are supposedly under Japanese sovereignty, but they're not Japanese. I mean, they are Ryukyans. They have a right to their self-determination. The same goes for the Moluccans. The same thing goes for the West Papuans and for the Rapa Nuis or for the Mapuches of Chile. These are important issues. And I think that the realization of self-determination must be recognized as a conflict prevention strategy. And it is the vocation of the United Nations to anticipate problems, to realize that many of these peoples aspiring to self-determination not only have a right to self-determination, but that if they do not get it, that might ultimately develop into a threat to local, regional, or international peace and security. So let us adopt preventative measures and let us have the self-determination item that used to be a permanent item in the Commission on Human Rights. Let us have the Human Rights Council adopt self-determination as a permanent item in its agenda. And henceforth, let us move forward with a concrete plan of action to implement Resolution 48/7. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor.